Upashama Prakarana, The Quiescence, Chapter 7, The Story of Suraghu. Heaven sprinkled snowflakes gently on the earth, flooding it with an ethereal light. The snow-covered road was lined on both sides with pines dressed in white like a community of brides. There was a strong, stinging breeze accompanying the snowfall that penetrated even the thick and protective winter clothing. The steep road could be seen from the open window of the horse buggy, which was the only mode of transport to the distant destination, a castle on top of a foothill of the Caucasus. The buggy was coming closer to the castle, and Ouspensky was approaching the turning point of his life. Peter D. Ouspensky, a Russian philosopher and occultist, had already carved out a name for himself in the scholastic world of philosophy. He had published a book entitled Tertium Organum, the Third Way or Method, and yet he did not feel fulfilled with all the recognition and fame, and so began his quest. When he heard of George Gurdjieff, he was fascinated and sought an interview with the mystic. It was a very remote place away from the turmoil of civilization where Gurdjieff stayed. All the scholarship did nothing to stop a peculiar nervousness that was creeping in. Finally, he reached his destination. It is said that the mystic was in his room with his disciples at that time. When Peter sent his card inside, a person with shaven head and a scary moustache peeped out of the door, and the bloodshot eyes were appraising the well-known author. After a while, which Ouspensky felt like ages, the man ordered him to write down all he knew on the paper and withdrew inside. For the first time, Ouspensky started really assessing and evaluating his so-called knowledge. To his utter surprise, he realized that all his knowledge was only a collection of words in the form of hypotheses and theories without any personal experience. That cold night in winter, cold sweat broke on the brow of Peter Ouspensky. Nearly an hour later, the commanding eyes could be seen again through the crack of the open door. Ouspensky confessed that he had not yet finished. The man said he could take all the time. Nearly 3 hours later, Peter handed over the piece of paper, totally blank. The man smiled for the first time and asked him to enter the room. The man was Gurdjieff himself. The great master welcomed him and said that when one realized that one knew nothing, one was really ready to learn. And so started Ouspensky's journey into himself. Gurdjieff's teaching was based on his observation that all actions of man are somnambulistic. During most of our actions, we are asleep to the action. Our sleep is metaphysical, and hence our eyes are open. But there is an undercurrent of incessant dreams, and the external action as such is mechanical. Gurdjieff used to advocate the path which he called self-remembering. This was called by Saint Kabir as Surati. Gurdjieff used to make his disciples perform action with total awareness. Mind, used to as it is to tread the beaten track, soon forgets and resorts to its old ways of dreaming, desiring, planning, rehearsing, etc. during all action. It has to be brought back again and again to the moment of action, or it has to be present to the action. One of the greatest problems a seeker faces is the forgetfulness that he or she is on the path. And it is so easy that it appears that the forgetfulness appears to have become a part of our nature. The ochre or white cloth, tonsured head or matted locks, rudraksha beads or water gourd or any other thing which marks out a monk or a recluse was perhaps more necessary for the seeker himself than others who came into his contact. Because looking at these things and using them reminds the seeker of her or his chosen way of life constantly. It is an altogether a different matter if such persons use their clothes and decorations as investments for exploiting the society or more dangerously for self-aggrandization and nourishing one's own ego. All the paths, without exception, lead us through the self-remembrance. In the first two limbs of Patanjali's system of yoga, Yama and Niyama, the social as well as personal behavior is disciplined. In the next three limbs of asana or posture, pranayama or breath control, and pratyahara or abstraction, one is introduced to awareness through body, vital force, and senses, respectively. In the last three limbs, that is, dharana or focusing, dhyana or meditation, and samadhi or trance, one handles the mental activity directly. This method was hinted in the preceding story of Uddalaka. Similarly, all other paths direct the seeker gradually towards self-awareness. Having got established at the center, one remains unperturbed amidst all turmoil of activity. This sarga begins with the enumeration of various means and methods for quietening the mental activity. Sage Vasishta said, Vairagyabhya sashastrartha prajnana guru yamakramaihi padamasadyate punyam prajna yaiveka yathava. The supreme state can be attained through vairagya and abhyasa of contemplation and constant remembrance of the essence of the Shastras, guidance of Guru, and practices like Yama, Niyama, etc., or through Prajna alone. The two mandatory wings necessary for the seeker in his spiritual flights are Vairagya or renunciation and Abhyasa or continual practice. They have been mentioned by sage Patanjali in his Yoga Darshanam. After explaining the 5 types of vrittis, he draws an outline of the whole scripture in these 2 words. Abhyasa vairagyabhyam tannirodha. Their elimination, that is the elimination of vrittis, is brought about by abhyasa and vairagya. The Bhagavad Gita also mentions these when Arjuna expresses his doubts regarding the success of a seeker in controlling the mind. Asamshayam mahabaho mano durnigraham chalam abhyasena tu kaunteya vairagyena cha grihyate. The mind is no doubt very difficult to control, O mighty armed, but it can be controlled through abhyasa and vairagya, O son of Kunti. Apparently, these 2 concepts appear simple to us as they are the most common words in possibly every language of India. However, the truth is that they are as difficult as their simple appearance. It is likely that one may take a lifetime even to begin practicing them. Abhyasa has been defined by sage Patanjali as Tatra stitau yatnabhyasaha, efforts towards being firmly established in that state of chitta vritti nirodha is abhyasa. Whatever effort directed towards the attainment of that transcendental state is abhyasa. However, This effort should be for a long time, without any interruptions, and there should be devotion and spirit of reverence. In the words of Patanjali, Satu dirgha kala nairantarya satkara sevito dhrida bhumihi. Consequently, all other things like swadhyaya or self-study, guidance from Guru, and yama niyama or abstinence and observance mentioned in the above shloka come under the abhyasa. And vairagya has been defined as follows. Drishtanushrava vishaya vitrishnasya vashikara samjna vairagyam. The awareness of the perfect mastery of desires in one who has ceased craving for all objects, seen or unseen, is vairagya. Vairagya has already been dealt elaborately in the first episode, entitled Vairagya Prakarana, through Rama's behavior and observations about life. In short, any effort to avoid distractions on the path is vairagya. Yoga Vasishta makes an additional statement, or through prajna alone. Prajna, or the awareness, is the key idea in this shloka. Any practice or effort without this mandatory companion is totally useless, as only the awareness can help us avoid mechanicalness in our practice. This is evident from our common experience. In our country, we have thousands of people practicing the so-called religion in the form of ritualistic worship, counting beads and chanting names. Many of us practice even asanas, pranayama and dharana for long periods and continually, so much so that some of us partake of the food only after performing our daily devotions. But unfortunately, all the years of practice does not bring any change in our lifestyle and habits. For instance, while telling beads and chanting names, the fingers move while the lips do the chanting, but the mind continues its planning, scheming or brooding. Or the practitioner forgets that he has to be totally awake during the practice. The forgetfulness makes the practice mechanical, reducing it to empty gestures and meaningless rituals. Prajna is so all-encompassing that it has the capacity to help the seeker in everything else, including abhyasa and vairagya. That may be the reason why George Gurdjieff stressed on self-remembrance only. After entering into the inner circles of disciples, Ouspensky was asked by Gurdjieff whether he remembers who he is all the time. Without any hesitation, Peter said that he does. But when he was made to sit with eyes closed and just repeat, "I am Ouspensky," Peter discovered that he could do so only 3 times, after which the mind would get distracted. When Peter confessed it, he was told by the master that he was not an exception but a general rule. Gradually, he was made to perform every little action, no matter how insignificant, with total awareness. Nearly 3 months later, Gurdjieff took Ouspensky to a town nearby. Ouspensky discovered, to his utter surprise, that almost everyone walked and performed action as if in deep sleep. It was as though everyone was suffering from somnambulism. They were driving the vehicles, walking, talking, eating, and even laughing in sleep. He was frightened and requested Gurdjieff to take him back immediately. Psychologists agree on this point, that the long-distance drivers of vehicles tend to spend most of their time in fantasies to avoid fatigue, while their eyes are on the road and their limbs handle the vehicles mechanically. At the above statement of Vasishta, Rama posed a question. There are two classes of men. One class frees itself from all pain to attain non-dual jnana through samadhi by remaining in the world of action, while the other class disengages itself totally from all the worldly activities to retire into samadhi. Rama wanted to know which of these two classes is superior. Sage Vasishtha replied that peace arises out of samadhi in the hearts of such persons who have seen through the temporality of the world made of three gunas. Some of them remain in Swarupa Samadhi without involving themselves in any external activity nor longing for any objects, while others go into Samadhi amidst all activity. There is no difference between them, provided the mind remains calm. Such calmness generates the merits of great tapas. The person who is in such state transcends all pleasure and pain in spite of being engaged in action. And if the mind is agitated while sitting motionless, it is no samadhi at all. But if the mind is free of all vasanas, even if the body is intensely active, as when one is dancing, such state is samadhi. There is no difference whatsoever between the jnanis who retire into forest and those who remain amidst the world of activity. With the elimination of all vasanas, any action performed is as if not done. Like the mind of a person deeply engaged within does not hear the story told by the storyteller. If there are innate vasanas inside, it performs actions in the dream state even if the gross mind is quiet and the body paralyzed. Sage Vasishtha continued that the two types of visions called dhyana and non-dhyana differ through the steadiness and the fluctuation of mind. Therefore, one must destroy all vasanas which generate thoughts. The quiescence and kaivalya pertain to the mind only. The body, devoid of all worry and desire, rests in the state of nirvana. After freeing oneself from the snares of I and its host of conceptions, it hardly matters where one lives, whether one lives in a house or the hills or any other place. The abode of the householders of the quiescent mind, not tainted by any ahankara, can well be a forest. The persons strolling through a market without any longing for things therein are like the persons who never go there. Similarly, to persons full of spiritual beatitudes, cities and woods do not make any difference. The enlightened sage continued that whenever the mind is agitated, the universe too appears agitated, for the world as one perceives it is only the manifestation of one's own mind. On the other hand, if one is calm within, the world too appears calm and beautiful. A person who is continually directing his energy towards silencing the mind by eliminating all vasana does not get involved with any wasteful activity. Vasishtha Muni reminded Rama that the essence of what he had said so far was to help the seeker understand that the prime goal is to quieten the mind, just like all names are simplified into one pranava or om to describe the Brahman. The comparison between one who retreats from action and the other remaining amidst action, as asked by Rama, crosses our mind once in a while. This much is true, that perhaps to stop questioning and to commence the quest, one has to retreat from such disturbing environment which keeps the outward flow of the mind. Like the wonderful example of Sri Ramakrishna, in which he compares the mind with milk and the world with water to keep the milk pure, we have to keep it away from water. But then, just physical retreat or stillness is not enough. If one sits still in a meditative posture, maybe like a statue of a Buddha, but is unable to keep the mind from wandering, it is of no use. On the contrary, there is the danger of the ego creeping in, which nurtures the complacency that if one is doing spiritual practices, one is superior to others who are not. There is a beautiful shloka in the Bhagavad Gita. Karmendriyani sanyamya ya aste manasa smaran indriyarthan vimudhatma mithyachara sa uchyate. A short-sighted man keeps remembering the objects of senses. Having controlled karmendriyas, the instruments of action, he is said to be engaged in the act of hypocrisy. Vaslav Nijinsky is a legend in the field of dancing. The most wonderful aspect of his dance was the unbelievable jumps and drops he would take during the ballet. The people who saw him dance felt that the gravitation had very little effect on him. It was as though he had become a feather in breeze. When people asked him as to how he achieved this next to impossible task, he replied that he too was as much surprised as the audience, because he said frankly, when he tried, he never succeeded. But it always happened when he lost himself in the dance. What he meant to say was that the dancer had totally merged in the dance, and that there is no dancer's ego. Unfortunately, his companions could not understand him, nor did they try to, and thus help him. Consequently, he was declared to be schizophrenic, which ultimately forced him to retire in 1919 at the age of 29. Had he come in contact with a person like Gurdjieff, things would have been altogether different. The symbol of Nataraja, or the Lord of Dancers, is based on this concept that, in spite of all the hectic activity of the Tandava dance, in which creation and destruction goes on simultaneously and continually, the dancer as such, Lord Shiva, remains unaffected and is totally merged with his dance. In other words, the dance has become totally spontaneous and effortless. Similarly, when the activity of the mind, including ahankara, has been quietened, the external activity and state makes no difference, and such person's external condition, activity or withdrawal from it, depends on her or his nature. Another aspect of Shiva is Satyam Shivam Advaitam, totally peaceful, devoid of activity, auspicious and non-dual. This again has an esoteric and hidden meaning behind it. Existence cannot be without its two wings of activity and rest. The dance represents the activity, while the silence represents peace and rest. Both activity and rest coexist from the lowest to the highest form of life. To illustrate that there is no difference between the two classes of persons, the great Vasishta narrated the story of Suraghu. A class of hunters named Hemajata lived in the Kailasa hills in the Himalayan range. They were adepts in archery. Their king, Suraghu, a matchless warrior, reigned over the kingdom, administering justice with an impartial spirit. Naturally, he had to protect the virtuous and chastise the vicious. Sometimes his justice would bring pain and misery to those who did not lead a dharmic or righteous life. The following ideas crossed his mind. Being their king, he had a position of power and strength. In fulfilling his responsibilities, some people were being afflicted by his justice. They may have committed the crimes due to some innate helplessness. Was not their misery his, who was their king? At the same time, it was his duty to mete out the punishments according to the Dharma Shastras to protect the virtuous and the meek. Thus, there was a conflict in his mind. At this time, Muni Mandavya appeared, to whom he poured out his tale of woe of the conflict. Muni Mandavya consoled him by telling him that all the stains of the mind will be washed away through Atma Vichara, like fog disappearing in the rays of sun. He continued that one has to engage oneself in reflecting over the questions: who am I? Whence came this universe? How came birth and death? Such vichara takes one to a subtler state when the mind becomes subservient to the will, freeing one from all conflict and resulting pain. For a calm mind that is free from all paradoxes, the worldly actions appear trivial, while the same paradoxes appear as the insurmountable obstacles to a disturbed mind. The great sage Mandavya observed that the farther one is from these snares of the universe, the nearer will one be to Brahman. Unless one is totally free from the objects, the true principle cannot be cognized. So the first thing one has to do is to eliminate the longing for the objects of senses. As and when the longing drops, one becomes available to pure jnana. If all dropping the gross vasanas, one succeeds in eliminating the vasanas or even the body, the stainless, beneficent principle will dawn on the person. The Muni returned to the abode of silence. Suraghu, the king of hunters, withdrew to a solitary place and began to inquire into the origin of I. Examining his own body, he noticed that it is the most affected among things which are subject to change, and it was childish to apply the epithet to body. Composed as it is of bones, flesh, etc., it is the grossest of all manifestations. Then he saw through the 10 indriyas, the instruments of knowledge and action, are always referred to as my indriyas. The indriyas are also only grosser manifestations. Thus, reflecting, Suraghu achieved antarmukhata, and the mental activity turned its attention totally on the I, which melted into the cosmic principle. Having established himself into the infinite, the rush for the objects of senses and the mind vanished. His vision became equanimous, freeing him from the bondage of actions and hence from the paradoxes of duality. Suraghu had a friend called Parigha in the race of Parasika, who too was a king. Finding that his subjects suffered greatly on account of drought, which continued for 10 long years in his kingdom, Parigha was heartbroken. That was why he gave up all desire for food and performed arduous tapas, feeding himself upon dry leaves. This action of his brought him the name Parnada. In due course, Parnada attained Atmajnana. He appeared before Suraghu, who welcomed him with reciprocal affection. They exchanged their experiences. After making inquiry about the welfare of his friend, Parnada made a long speech on the qualities and characteristics of Atmajnanis. While Suraghu listened to him in all joy, when Parnada concluded that Suraghu had attained the Brahmic state and that his heart had been liberated, Suraghu smilingly added that one can attain the highest when all longing for fruit of action ceases and the mind remains quiescent. He said that such an enlightened man can never experience forgetfulness, as there is the continual and constant current of prajna as the shruti or the monotone which guides the music. activity of any kind mostly originates with desire for fruit of that action. In fact, almost all our actions are motivated by the desire for their respective fruits. And desires are nothing but peeps into future when we stop accepting the condition we are presently in. The great goad of action, called desire, is the one which contributes to most of the progress made by human beings. Not only that, but it gives us the will to survive and live. While for most of us, desire is almost as mandatory as breath itself. For those of us who have got glimpses into the deeper dimensions and have realized that survival is not the only aspect of life, desire becomes a great barrier. Moreover, every action, no matter how insignificant, has a potential conflict in it. For a king like Suraghu, who was meting out his duties justly, it is more so, as he has to be very objective to punish the wrongdoers. But if he becomes sensitive to the pain of others and is also very much conscious of his duties, as was the case with Suraghu, this duty consciousness becomes a great burden. It is at this time that one needs spiritual guidance. When one arrives at a stage in which she or he is receptive to deeper truths, the help arrives on its own. Maharshi Ramana was approached by people from all walks of life. In his presence, everyone would experience a peace, of course, according to the eligibility of the one who approached him. The seekers who had managed to calm their gross mental activity would be invariably given one panacea for all their problems. For a person having a conflict, he would ask, "Who is having this conflict?" and suggest her or him to trace out the experiencer of the conflict. Initially, it was always confusing, as invariably the answer would pop up, "I am having the conflict, who else?" Maharshi would then ask the person to trace the very entity whom she had called I. But if the conflict was to the point of disturbance, then the person would not be able to catch the mood of this wonderful question. And that was why the great sage Ramana would recommend some easier methods to such people so as to have their mental activity under control. And when the mental activity had reduced considerably, invariably the suggestion would work wonders as it led the seeker towards antarmukhata, the mandatory preliminary step in spirituality. Muni Mandavya advised Suraghu to start the process of tracing the root of all experience, the I, which led him towards enlightenment. While Suraghu does his spiritual practices while performing his duties, Parnada's life illustrates that one can also totally withdraw from active life to plunge into a life dedicated to sadhana and to receive the same jnana that was caught by Suraghu. One thought that gets repeated often in this Shastra is the uniqueness of the individual. There is no hard and fast rule with should and must. Almost anything can trigger a disinterest and renunciation towards things which were held dear to the heart, leading one towards the spirit of inquiry. This is evident from the lives of innumerable saints, including a robber like Ratnakar, who became the Valmiki, the great author of the present scripture, and a murderer like Angulimala, who was transformed under the guidance of the Buddha. This repetition is done to warn the seeker that she or he should be careful never to imitate. There are millions of species of living organisms, including those which are in between, like viruses. And there is perhaps more variety on the psychological plane, with its variety of moods, emotions, and thoughts having a constant kaleidoscopic change. The creativity of the reality or truth is so infinite that it can go on for ages and yet remain inexhaustible. By imitating what we do is to undermine this wonderful fact and in turn underestimate ourselves. Adventure sports are becoming more and more popular. Whether it is a thrilling ride on the rapids through the mountainous terrain, or scaling the heights of a snow-peaked mountain, or skiing on the slopes of mountain glacier, or skating on a crystal clear lake behind a speeding boat, or jumping from the mountain peaks for hang gliding, or participating in car and motorcycle races and rallies, human beings are definitely seeking something more than just sensual pleasure. Because, in spite of the fact that sensitivity is reckless, as sensuality is reckless as far as the health is concerned, it cannot be callous towards life. When some of these adventurers were asked as to why they involve in such dangerous sports, the answer was that they felt alive only when they faced the challenge of death. If we just analyze, we are pleasantly surprised to discover that in those moments of danger, the adventurer is forced to be totally alert, and to the people for whom life has become mechanical and boring, a few moments of alertness act as elixir to renew their zest for life. Each one of us has the capacity for achieving the highest through the singular path meant for each one of us. The act of searching for that very path, the trials and tribulations one faces during this search, and the joy of its discovery are more than any adventure we embark on in the physical plane. Because what really is mandatory in spirituality is the unbroken prajna or the awareness. And even if there is an insignificant lapse on the part of the seeker, he can become a victim of a great fall into the abysm of unconsciousness, animalhood. Aitreya Upanishad declares, Prajnane pratishthitam, prajnanenno lokaha, prajna pratishta, prajnanam brahma. Existence has the eye of prajnanam. It exists in prajnanam and rests in prajnanam, and that is why prajnanam is the highest Brahman. When a seeker sows the seed, nurtures the seedling, looks after and protects the young plant, and cares for the tree of awareness, the awareness in turn does the same to the seeker, only in a more benign way. And without this mandatory companion, no practice can do anything to the seeker except perhaps give an elusive satisfaction of reaching the horizon. The awareness gives the much needed patience and in turn makes the seeker dance his way to enlightenment lightly and gracefully without any anxiety or worry. Because the awareness makes the seeker realize that every step is the horizon she or he had been seeking.